Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for 24 years. And I was introduced to these practices during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and panic disorder. And my panic disorder had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was on disability. I was unable to leave the house. My entire life stopped. And I was fortunate enough to be paired up with a psychologist who, even 24 years ago, long before mindfulness became the flavor of the month, had already been practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation for several decades. And that was the beginning of my journey. And I'm glad that our journeys have intersected today. Thank you for being here. This is the next in my ongoing series of calming anxiety by living mindfully. And in this series, I like to offer various tools and techniques that I've been shown, some that I've discovered for myself, for dealing with anxiety, panic, fear, stress. And I hope that perhaps today's, along with some of the others, may resonate for you. Let's go ahead and jump in, okay? I always like to begin my sitting by imagining that I am suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head. As a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. If we're feeling some tension right now, that's fine. It's completely fine. Usually when we're experiencing tension, we notice it. The natural inclination is to try to get rid of it. And how do we get rid of something? Well, we usually try to force it away. Which is what? Just trying to get rid of tension with more tension. I've never really found that to work well. So if there's some tension here, I just notice, oh, there's tension. This is what it's like. This is where I notice it. It's allowed to be here. And it's allowed to leave in its own time. Maybe today, may not. I also like to notice what is in contact with the chair, the cushion, the floor. So there's a sense of grounding. Something is supporting me, holding me up. I can allow it to do so. Let's take a moment to notice this support beneath us and this suspension from the ceiling. And whatever else we happen to find in between the two for us right now. However it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. You may notice as soon as you do so, you begin to control or shape the breathing. Perhaps we think that the breathing needs to be a certain way for our practice. Or perhaps because it's just very difficult to bring attention to the breathing without trying to interfere with it in some way. But just like with tension that might be here, we can allow the breathing to be as it is. Or if we notice that we are controlling and shaping the breathing, either because we want to, or because we're not sure how not to, then we simply notice the controlling or the shaping as it is. Take a moment and notice what your experience of the breathing is. Long or short, deep, shallow, comfortable, uncomfortable, controlled, uncontrolled. Simply see what you have here now for a few moments, however it is. Now, for those of you who, like me, have some interest in Buddhism, and teachings of the historical Buddha, know that he only taught one thing, which is how do we alleviate our suffering? Not our pain. Pain's that thing we don't have a choice about. Pain, discomfort, these are going to happen. They're part of this life. Suffering is what arises when we do not deal with pain, discomfort, in a way that is skillful. One of the things that we hear a lot about in these teachings is clinging, grasping. Sometimes we hear that suffering comes from clinging and grasping to things, particularly in a thought sense. One of the teachers that I read a lot of works from says that's not quite the case. The case is that suffering is the clinging and grasping in itself. Suffering doesn't come from clinging and grasping. Suffering is the clinging and grasping. That's a suffering process. But sometimes I find it helpful to put this clinging, this grasping, in a slightly different context. It's not entirely different. It's still clinging, it's still grasping. But from a slightly different perspective. Rather than thinking of it from a mental standpoint or an emotional standpoint. I look to see where there might be some clinging, some grasping, some clutching, in and around the body. Perhaps in relation to the breathing. For example, I usually do my sitting on a kneeling bench. And of course, the kneeling bench is made of wood. It's on a solid floor. I'm not the largest person. So this bench, this floor, more than capable of holding me up. As I was saying before, supporting me. And yet, sometimes I will notice I'm tensing my legs, squeezing, clutching. As if I don't quite trust that these objects can hold me up. Very often I'll notice a subtle grasping in my stomach. perhaps in relation to a certain thought, certain feeling, certain anticipation. Or maybe not to anything I can really tie it to at the particular moment, but still there. And like I was saying at the beginning with tension, we don't need to try to get rid of these processes, these sensations. Because there's a subtle catch-22 in there, isn't there? If we're trying to get rid of grasping, then we're grasping non-grasping. If we try to stop clinging, we are clinging to non-clinging. So we simply shine the light of attention on these processes, on these phenomena. That's what allows them to process. Like the light of the sun, allowing a plant to process. The plant will grow, develop, change, and ultimately pass. Let's take a few moments. Anchor on the breathing. Notice where we might be feeling some form of clinging, grasping, clutching. Perhaps in relation to the breathing. Or any other area in the body. Not with the intention of changing it. Things change on their own anyway. We don't have to make them change. Ironically, by trying to make them change, we often keep them here longer. Simply noticing the process as a process. If the process that you are working with is something other than the breathing itself, you may notice what the effect is of sending the breathing to that area. And it doesn't have to actually be physical. If you're perhaps noticing some tension in your legs, like I mentioned earlier, you're not really going to send your breath there in the way that you would to the stomach or the chest. But we know that the breath is ultimately making it to every cell in the body. So we can picture the breathing going to that area, knowing that it ultimately is. And again, we're not trying to make anything happen. We're just seeing what the effect is, if any. And in this case, we might see if there's a physical effect, a change in the sensation, perhaps a mental effect, a change in our perception of the sensation. Because that's what's really bothering us most of the time, right? It's not the sensation itself. It's our perception of the sensation. Right? We feel a lot of the same sensations during a joyous excitement that we do during anxiety. But we have a very different perception of them, usually based upon the context in which they're happening. So quickened breathing, accelerated heart rate. We have a very different perception of those depending on whether they're happening from, say, an anxiety attack versus a sporting event. Same physical processes. Similar sensations, very different perception, different interpretation. When it's the more pleasant context, we don't try to do anything about them and they just pass. When we have the more unpleasant connotation, well, then we try to do something about it. We fight with them. Try and get rid of them. Try to make them pass. And what happens? They stay longer. And what do we do when they stay longer? We try to get rid of them harder. And you see where that goes. So we just shine the light of attention. Not grasping, not clinging. Even to non-grasping and non-clinging. As you go through the rest of your day, you may take a moment here, a moment there, and check in. Where is there some clinging, some grasping? Around the breathing, somewhere in the body. Or you may expand it to the mind, emotions. Notice if there's that tendency to try to interfere. And just shine that light of attention. Not just on the process, but also on the desire to interfere. Because that's just a process too. Bring a sustained light of attention. Not a harsh light, just a steady one. Onto whatever processes make themselves known. Your job is simply to hold that light.